Alrighty, so today we are going to be talking on the topic of pawn tension, a very fundamental topic in chess strategy, which I found a lot of players under this level, anywhere below 2000 FIDE, very often don't have the best grasp on. And in general, I would say there are two sorts of extremes that people usually lie between when it comes to dealing with tension. And the first type is the person who, you look at their games and they just start like, they think as checkers, they're like taking everything in sight, and as long as the exchange doesn't lose material, they're just taking everything, right? And the second type of player is maybe a bit more conservative. They realize that, oh, okay, like sometimes releasing the tension, this isn't very good. I heard somewhere in a YouTube video like, oh, to take is a mistake. I heard that when I was younger at least. And that can definitely be quite enlightening because you're like, oh yeah, like I have been making a lot of dumb exchanges where probably I shouldn't have been. But at the same time, there are many positions in chess where you should be releasing the tension. So, when is it that you keep the tension? When is it you release the tension? And I am going to show some examples in this video to hopefully shine a light upon when it is or is not suitable to release the tension. But in general, I would say you want to be paying attention to these three things whenever you're at a crossroads between whether you should keep or release the tension. And in particular, when you release the tension, you want to be paying attention to these changes. So the change in piece activity, the changes in pawn structure, and any new pawn breaks that are available as a result of the change in the pawn structure. So first of all, to get out of the way some basic examples where releasing the tension is not a good idea. This is a position I found where one of my younger students I coach, he just took on d4, which is obviously a strategic mistake because after c takes d4, black has just helped white get rid of their doubled pawns. And this also helps open up the position perhaps for white's bishop pair. So there's multiple reasons you should not be releasing the tension here. You should be probably trying to play d6, e5 and establish some sort of dark squared setup. I've talked about this thing in some of my videos on the Nimzo-Indian. I'll put a card up somewhere if you're interested in that. Here is a position very early on in the opening where you can see there's some tension between the d and e pawns. There are a couple things white can do in this position. It is considered by theory that bishop c4 is best, but having a look in the Lichess database, it's rather concerning that almost as popular as bishop c4 is d takes e5, but this just releases attention in unfavorable circumstances because you have to understand that this change in pawn structure is not really that beneficial to white. Like before we had a nice base advantage, but like when we take on e5, right, you have to sort of think this pawn is taking up more space in the center compared to this d6 pawn, right? So logically speaking, unless there's something concrete, it doesn't really make sense to do this pawn exchange. And not to mention that it also helps open this diagonal for black's bishop, which is a change in the sort of piece activity you could think about that arises from white making this exchange. Compare that to, let's say, if we play bishop c4 and black takes. Well, probably is also not that great of an exchange for black because then like either white can take for the queen or the knight and we keep our sort of space advantage in the center while we can also develop a piece and make it more active at the same time. There are some nuances to this though. Sometimes this exchange is strong, but probably at this point in the opening, it is a little bit too early. Here's another position. This one, if you've watched some of my videos on the Cadon, you would hopefully be at least vaguely familiar with. And in this position, the way white usually plays is we want to try to play something like queen c2, knight d2, and aim for the e4 break, increase the pressure in the center, try to get black to release the tension somehow, and after all is said and done, white will probably have a space advantage. But what we don't really want to do is take on d5, because now after e takes d5, the c takes d5 is also okay, but I think e takes d5 is even better, where beforehand you can see that their light squared bishop is a bit of a passive piece. It's stuck inside the pawn chain, but after e takes d5 it is now liberated. And also you have to realize that making this exchange the c pawn for the e pawn does somewhat relinquish part of white's base advantage. But to give some slightly more nuanced examples now, this is a very common mainline position that can happen out of the Ruy Lopez opening, and white has just on their last move played h3 to stop bishop g4 and prepare d4. If you go d4 immediately in this position, bishop g4 is slightly annoying, so to prepare this move, people usually play h3 first, and then there's a few different moves black can play. For example, bishop b7 is called the Zaitsev variation, and after d4, rook e8 is considered by theory to be black's best move. But a lot of people at lower levels, they sort of start freaking out. They're like, oh, white has a pawn there, and they just like snatch it off. But then we take back, and you have to realize that this change in the structure is probably beneficial to white, because now, if you noticed a second ago, the space, okay, white might have a bit more in the center, but at least black does have this stronghold on e5 that is somewhat keeping stuff together. But after you like exchange this off, well, white still has their 2 pawns in the center because the c3 guy just replaced the other pawn that was there before, and now they have a nice central majority. So unless black has something concrete that they can do, this is probably going to be beneficial to white. Not to mention that we can also use this newly freed up c3 square to develop our knight too, and that can further assist in helping control the center. But let's look at another line in the Ruy Lopez. So knight a5, this is a Chigorin, and after bishop c2, usually the idea is, okay, the knight obviously is slightly misplaced right now, but the idea is to bring the c pawn forward and help increase the pressure on the center. White usually just plays d4 anyway, and it's worth noting if you just take a bunch of times, well, white still has a little bit more space in the center, and long term you might have to deal with this pawn on d6 being slightly weak. And also by bringing the knight to this active d4 square, you've given it some extra possibilities, like maybe coming to f5 and starting to poke around the king side a little bit, maybe also trying to win the bishop here, but this bishop is a little bit passive right now, so maybe not for now. But even if we just step back a little bit, even if black, let's just say, only takes once and they don't take twice in the middle of the board, this still somewhat helps white because we still get the c3 square that our knight can develop to. So that is why in this position, actually, the main theoretical move is for black to go queen c7. And the whole idea is you're basically, okay, for one, you're protecting e5, that's quite important. And a very popular move is now for white to go knight bd2. It's also possible to maybe take or go d5, but generally takes is going to somewhat help black because, okay, white's giving up a bit of their space advantage. And a lot of the times a concern for black is whenever they play bishop b7, white's going to block that bishop in with this move d5, but that's not as much a concern when, of course, you've exchanged a pawn off, so that helps black's pawn structure overall and also their piece activity a little bit as well. But if white keeps attention to themselves and plays knight bd2, well, now you have to note, right, that when black plays c takes d4 in this position, now it's a little bit different to this position, right? Because here the knight could come to c3, whereas this one, not really, right? It's already committed itself to d2, and black usually now brings the knight back to c6 from this slightly misplaced a5 square. Sometimes it comes to b4 to gain a tempo on the bishop, and okay, the game goes on, but it's important to appreciate these small details in the position and see how the evaluation of a very similar looking move can change with just these two moves inserted. But I would also like to come back to the Zaitsev variation we just talked about earlier. So after d4, we talked about how e takes d4 in this position is not that great. However, it is worth noting that this is sometimes an idea in many Ruy Lopez variations. Take, move the knight out of the way, attack the bishop, white probably wants to keep that, and then let's say goes c5, and you get this sort of pawn break, chipping away a little bit at white's center and also gaining some space on the queen side. However, I think in this position d5 is quite an annoying move. The knight is somewhat stranded on the queen side now on this a5 square. It might have to take this slightly awkward route back to b6 where it's still not doing that much, and this bishop is also quite shut in. But if we say take a few different moves, so let's say d4, rook e8, knight bd2, bishop f8, a4, white gains some space on the queen side. Let's say we have h6, bishop c2, just guarding the center a little bit. In this position, the circumstances have changed a little bit now, and e takes d4 has actually gained in strength, because after takes knight b4, you attack the bishop. Let's say the bishop goes back, c5, you gain counterplay on the queen side, and now, okay, white does get the same move d5, but it's a little bit more complicated now because this knight is, instead of being on a5, it's on b4, and you can maybe see c4, knight c5, white has the d3 square, and black gets some interesting counterplay. They, of course, cannot kick this knight out on b4 with a3 very easily because they had already committed to a4. So in this case, you can see that the pawn structure looks very similar from this other position we just looked at, but because in the specific changes to how black can use their pieces to gain this very nice activity, this position is sort of okay, while this one not so much. So on to the next example, I want to look at a d4 opening from the Slav defense, or it could soon become a Semi-Slav. And of course in the Ruy Lopez, right, we had this tension between the pawn being here and the d4 and e5 guys. But in many Queen's Gambit openings, it's the tension between the c and d pawns that we're really looking out for. And well, let's say if white just develops a knight, right, well, usually black isn't just going to take because white takes back in one whole tempo and we sort of get this queen side. Sorry, I don't know why I said queen side, but we get the central pawn majority. So usually what black will do is they like develop the knight and they wait for white to develop the bishop, and now they snatch the pawn. And okay, you sort of give white again this central majority, but again, when the pawn structure changes, you want to be paying attention to the possible pawn breaks that you obtain as a result of that. And in this position, b5 is a very interesting and just very typical pawn break overall, and many d4 openings you get after this sort of exchange happens. Let's say white brings the bishop back, and okay, black has a few different moves. One they could try is maybe a6. They try to go for c5 next and gain counterplay in the center / queen side. And by the way, just to make things clear, this is the most respected and popular way to play this position. Black could just develop and keep the tension, but eventually white's probably going to get in the e4 break if black is a bit too slow on this one. But another twist we could throw in the position is, let's say white plays pawn to b3, defending this guy on c4 with our own pawn, and now let's say after knight bd7 we bring the bishop out. If black takes on c4, right, we're not committed to taking with the bishop because we can take with the pawn now, and now this whole black release and tension like this does not look as good, because again, this change in structure really feels like it benefits white with all the space that we now have in the center. The b5 break does certainly not work as well as it did before. It kind of looks like it just loses the pawn now. Well, actually, I guess technically, I mean, they could do this and they might have some queen a5 trick, but we could probably just keep the tension castle, ignore it, and this would be okay. So it is still possible for them to, again, go for a pawn break in the center, change the structure a little bit. By the way, that is not a free pawn, because if you take twice, they have queen to a5 check, forking the king and the knight there. I know that arrow did not hit the king, but you get what I mean. And if we say keep the tension, also stopping this e4 fork, eventually we can get to this sort of pawn structure where white does somewhat have these hanging pawns in the center, but overall we're still a little bit better because our pieces are more active, which would lead us to overall conclude that probably in this position it doesn't make that much sense for them to quite release the tension, even though they might have this pawn break afterwards. If they didn't go for that pawn break, then they would be very passive, and probably we shouldn't be too concerned about that. However, let's say they go bishop d6, they just keep the tension and both sides just develop, and we get a very normal looking position like this one. And now let's say white goes for what looks like a very standard pawn break, e4. And this is a sort of position where it's quite difficult for black to really, realistically speaking, just keep the tension, because if they do, well, e5 is a very annoying fork. If they move the bishop back to avoid the fork, then they're gonna drop a pawn. So after e4 in this position, a lot of people just take on e4, but I would still say, white benefits quite a bit from this. We still have a bit more space. They can't go for c5 at the moment. If they go for knight f6, bishop d3, and then c5, well, in this position, it looks like they kind of drop a pawn on h7. So, and then like, okay, the bishop here, but we're going to trade that off very quickly, and then we're just a queen pawn up. And if they don't go for c5 now, they take another move, they just do something like h6 to guard this, then we go c5 ourselves, get rid of this pawn break for them, and this is a very passive position, I believe. Or actually, you might have to be a little bit careful, because there might be some sort of tactic like this, I think. And yeah, if takes, then they're up a pawn at the end of this, but maybe we get takes, and the kingside structure is ruined a little bit. I'm getting a bit too into the weeds of stuff. This is not quite what I wanted to talk about, but in general, this sort of exchange does slightly benefit white. However, there is a very interesting way that black can also release the tension in this position that we just looked at before, right, which is d takes c4. And of course, if bishop takes c4, maybe they can kick us with b5, and then like, if we go back, they can maybe play e5. Otherwise, this would be incredibly annoying to deal with. And okay, they're probably doing about okay in this position. But what if we, take back the pawn, right? And this is actually quite interesting, because the structure has changed a little bit compared to this sort of position where we had the pawn on e3, Whereas in this position, if they go for e5, we can no longer recapture back on d4. And what that sort of means is that if we just like bring a rook to the center or something, keep the tension, now we have some squares now, or squares, I mean like some holes, I guess they are squares as well, that are sort of a little bit weak. And because of that, I feel like black is doing relatively okay in this position. And it might also look very principled to go d5, but again, knight c5, black gets a c5 square, and sure, white does have this very strong looking passed pawn, but it's sort of balanced out again by the outposts that we've given our opponent with the c5 square. And just in general, I guess the dark squares quite a few of them feel a bit weak in general, not just c5. And so again, this point really emphasizes again that point of when you are thinking about releasing the tension, don't just look at the position for what it is right now, look at it for what can change in the position and the pawn breaks your opponent has, because a lot of people would never really consider d takes c4 because they're just like, oh, but then like my opponent gets a huge center, that looks horrible. But what they don't do is then like sort of have this like almost moving image in their head you can think of, where they're then thinking immediately like, well, okay, there's still things that can change, and like, okay, I can go for this pawn break myself, and then there's a whole new set of changes that is really going on in the position. But okay, the final example I want to show today that is from a very time-tested opening, the Nimzo-Indian. This is like a very classical variation that can happen in the e3-1. This exact line is not very popular these days, but it's interesting to study anyway because it has a lot of interesting strategical elements to it. But okay, I want to really start from this position. So obviously white has these double pawns right now. They also have the bishop here, and there's a lot of tension going on in the center, and it's like, okay, what's going on? Obviously if black just takes on like this square, well, they undouble our c pawns, and that's probably not a great idea. So probably black does not want to take on d4. However, it is very common for them to take on c4, and at this point, okay, after bishop takes c4, I would like you guys to take a small think and think about what sort of follow-up would make sense for black to play in this position. And well, again, as I've been saying multiple times throughout this video now, when you release the tension, okay, you want to observe whatever change there is in the pawn structure, who's that benefit. But in addition to that, of course, you always must be thinking about the pawn breaks that can follow after that, and e5 makes a lot of sense, further increasing the pressure on the white center. However, it is worth noting, right, that let's say white plays like a waiting move with pawn to h3, the last thing black wants to do in this world is take twice and then open the position for the bishops. You don't want to do that. You are increasing the pressure, but you really want white to take and release the tension. This is what you want. Like after e5, if white takes, notice how white now gets an isolated c-pawn, but we do have to be careful of one thing, which is that we are slightly opening the position up. So if this bishop can sort of get opened eventually with c4, it might not be so bad even though the structure is not the best. So let's say queen e2, bishop e6, and now they're trying to prepare c4. So, you know, as black in this position, you want to be quite careful, and if possible, you would like to just shut this bishop in with a move like c4. And while that might look like it hangs a pawn right now, this actually is justified tactically. You have knight to g4 attacking this pawn, g3, and this all just works out. This is not the focus of what we want to be talking about, but it is instructive to see the sequence play out. So knight to e5, and there's just a lot of weak light squares around the white king in general. At the very least, we can just come in, infiltrate with the rook. There's always knight f3 in the air, maybe g5 as well, breaking apart the king side. For example, if you come back to b3, then immediately this sort of fails to knight f3 check, knight e2, and you'll win an exchange, and with that probably a decisive advantage. So probably white is best off instead going something like bishop to c2, and well, in this position they then suffer from the strategic element of their bishop being shut in, and for reasons I should not need to explain, this is obviously not very appealing from white's perspective. Hence, when we come back to this position earlier, this is how we got to here, right? It probably wasn't a great decision for them to release the tension so early, because they could not open this bishop up on the diagonal, get that change in piece activity that would be favorable with releasing the tension. Instead, it was black who got the better outcomes in terms of not only a better pawn structure, but also piece activity. Also, I should mention, you can technically now play c4 and open the bishop up, but it's not the same once you've traded off the bishop here, and long term you still have this weak c pawn. So to show an example of a position where white did get this under favorable circumstances though, so let's say we have b6, a bit slow, they should go for e5 immediately, but okay, white brought the bishop back, sort of making way for the c pawn. If black is a bit slow and they just go for this, then probably c4. But with the pawn on e5, okay, if you go c4 now, well, okay, I was thinking maybe d4 could be a bit loose, but there's also just e4, and you get forked. So white, to deal with this, they played queen c2, keeping an eye over this, bishop b7, and now the Ukrainian grandmaster Anton Korobov, he played this move D takes e5. There's also e4, which is quite strong, just gaining space in the center, and if black releases attention, it should favor white. But D takes e5, again, it looks a bit anti-positional because like you are saddling yourself with this isolated c pawn now, but because after takes, we get c4, opening this bishop up on the diagonal now, and these bishops are working quite well together. White actually has quite a bit of a nice advantage here. And okay, it goes on a little bit, like okay, black could poke around and pose some little threats, but I think this still works out quite well. F4 is strong, and in the game, bishop takes f6 was played, which I think Anton was scared about some knight g4 stuff, and it is a little bit annoying. Like for example, if e4 immediately, knight g4 is an issue, because there's not only queen takes e2, but also there's knight e3 threats, but this could have been dealt with by just playing rook a to e1 immediately, and now if knight g4, just go h3, and this is not a threat. And so in this position, white definitely has at least a slight advantage because of the bishop pair. Sure, our pawn structure is not the best, but again, bishop pair and also something like e4 to e5 coming, definitely a nice position for white to be in. And hopefully just again goes to demonstrate that something like saying, you know, oh, like if you release attention, that helps make the opponent's pieces more active, is a bit too black and white, and it doesn't really illustrate the whole situation that is going on. You really have to pay attention to these nuances in the position. Again, the three things I said earlier, sort of the change in the pawn structure, the change in the piece activity, and any new pawn breaks that you get as a result of the change in the pawn structure. So yeah, these are the three main examples I want to give for this video though. Hope this has been useful, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe if you're not already for some reason, and yeah, there'll be a video somewhere up that you can watch next. But yeah, hope you guys have a good day.